Hey everybody, this week's Torah portion is Parshas Bo. Doesn't get any shorter than that, 2 letters to the name. And in this week's Torah portion we have a very interesting mitzvah. The Torah tells us that there is a commandment upon the Jewish people not to own any chametz over Passover. We can't even own it. Why? Because there's another mitzvah that you can't eat chametz. So in order to prevent us from eating it, we're commanded an additional commandment not to own it. Which means that originally there may have been an idea to have 612 commandments, but we had to add another one in, or God had to add another one in, to prevent us from violating one of them. So we can't own it in order to prevent us from eating it, which is really the problem. Now, the problem with that is that we don't find this in other areas of mitzvos. We don't find that God made many mitzvos and then added on other ones to prevent us from doing that. Why specifically with the mitzvah of chametz, not eating chametz, do we have a special fence around it from the Torah itself, not one that the rabbis made, but the Torah itself made? Why is there a special fence around the mitzvah of not eating chametz, which requires us to not even own it? And in order to understand that, we have to understand what it was that really got the Jewish people out of Egypt at the end of this week's Torah portion. What was it that made the Jews, or gave the Jews the merit to be able to leave Egypt? So the Talmud tells us that there was something very unique about the Jewish people. In many ways, they resembled the Egyptians. They worshipped the same idols for many of them. We almost completely assimilated to the extent that there was no more circumcision amongst most of the Jewish people. So the very physical identifying mark of a Jew is not there. However, there was something Jewish about the Jews, and that was that they made a fence for themselves when they got into Egypt, and they said, we were going to make sure that we retain Jewish names and a Jewish language. That was not a law, it was a fence that the Jews placed upon themselves, which lasted throughout the entire exile, that even when they gave up on circumcision, and even when they were worshipping idols, the one thing they did retain was a little bit of Jewish identity by calling themselves by Jewish names and retaining a Jewish language. And it was that fence that they set themselves up with that kept them Jewish enough in order to be able to not assimilate to the extent they were able to get out of Egypt. And it was that message that they sent to themselves that God now said, you know what? I want to remind you of what got you out of Egypt. How am I going to do that? On the holiday of Passover, I'm also going to create a fence. Just as you created a fence for yourselves to protect yourselves from falling into assimilation, I too will make an extra mitzvah, which is a fence around another mitzvah, to remind you that the way you got out of here was because you were able to make those fences to protect yourself, not from what was illegal, but make sure not to even come near what could potentially be very damaging to the Jewish people. On behalf of Makaravi, Shabbat Shalom.